The desperation of love. The village of Eldermere was a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, where the seasons changed with a gentle rhythm, and where the people lived simple lives. But for Elias, the village was a prison. His wife, Lila, was dying. Lila had been the light of his life, the one person who had always been there for him, through thick and thin. She had been his rock, his confidant, his everything. But now, she was fading away, her once vibrant spirit dimming with each passing day. The healers had done all they could, but their remedies were no match for the illness that was slowly consuming her. Elias felt helpless, watching the woman he loved slip away from him. It was on a cold, moonless night that Elias first heard the legend of the Silver River. He had been sitting by Lila's bedside, holding her hand as she slept, when an old man named Thaddeus entered the room. Thaddeus was the village storyteller, a man who had traveled far and wide in his youth and had returned with tales of wonders and horrors beyond imagination. "Elias," Thaddeus said, his voice low and gravelly, "there is a way to save her, but it is a path fraught with danger, and the price may be more than you are willing to pay." Elias looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do anything to save her." Thaddeus hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There is a river far to the north beyond the mountains. It is said to flow with liquid silver, and those who drink from its waters are granted immortality. But there is a curse. Those who drink from the river will forget who they are. They will lose their memories, their identity, everything that makes them who they are." Elias's heart raced. Immortality, the chance to save Lila, to keep her by his side forever. But at what cost? To forget her, to forget the life they had built together? It was a price that seemed too high to pay. But as he looked down at Lila, her face pale and drawn, he knew he had no choice. "I have to try," Elias said, his voice firm. "I have to save her." Thaddeus nodded, his expression grave. "Then you must leave at once. The journey is long and treacherous, and time is not on your side." Elias stood, his resolve hardening. He would find the Silver River, and he would save Lila, no matter the cost. The journey begins. Elias left Eldermere at dawn, his pack heavy with supplies and his heart heavier with fear. The village was still asleep, the streets empty and silent, as he made his way toward the northern mountains. Thaddeus had given him a map, though it was old and faded, its edges frayed and its ink smudged. The path to the Silver River was marked by a series of landmarks. A towering oak with a split trunk, a waterfall that glowed under the full moon, and a cave guarded by a stone bear. Elias memorized the route, though he knew the journey would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The first few days were uneventful. Elias followed the winding trails through the forest, the dense canopy overhead filtering the sunlight into a patchwork of gold and green. He passed through meadows filled with wildflowers and crossed streams so clear he could see the pebbles at the bottom. But as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The air grew colder, the trees taller and more foreboding. The cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by the distant howl of wolves and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. On the 5th day, Elias reached the base of the mountains. The peaks loomed above him, their snow-capped summits disappearing into the clouds. The path ahead was steep and treacherous, littered with loose rocks and hidden crevices. Elias tightened the straps of his pack and began the ascent, his breath visible in the crisp mountain air. It was on the 2nd day of climbing that he encountered the first real danger. He was crossing a narrow ledge, his back pressed against the rock face, when the ground beneath him gave way. Elias barely had time to grab onto a protruding root before the ledge crumbled into the abyss below. His heart pounded as he dangled there, his fingers slipping on the wet, moss-covered root. With a grunt of effort, he pulled himself up and collapsed onto solid ground, his chest heaving. As he lay there, catching his breath, Elias couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake. The journey was already more perilous than he had anticipated. and he hadn't even reached the Silver River yet. What if the legend was just that, a legend? What if there was no river, no cure for Lila's illness? But then he thought of her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, and he knew he had to keep going. He couldn't give up, not when there was even the slightest chance of saving her. By the time Elias reached the waterfall Thaddeus had described, he was exhausted. The waterfall was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its waters shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as if the moonlight had been trapped within them. The air around it was thick with mist, and the sound of the crashing water was deafening. Elias stood there for a moment, mesmerized by the sight, before remembering the next landmark, the cave guarded by a stone bear. He found the cave a short distance from the waterfall, its entrance partially hidden by a curtain of ivy. The stone bear stood at the entrance, its features weathered but still imposing. Its eyes seemed to follow Elias as he approached, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, watching him. He hesitated at the entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The cave was dark and silent, and the thought of what might be waiting inside sent a shiver down his spine. But Elias had come too far to turn back now. He took a deep breath and stepped into the cave, the darkness swallowing him whole. The Cave of Whispers. The cave was colder than Elias had expected, the air damp and heavy with the scent of earth and moss. The faint light from the entrance quickly faded as he ventured deeper, leaving him in near total darkness. He fumbled in his pack for a torch and flint, his hands trembling slightly as he struck the sparks. The torch flared to life, casting flickering shadows on the rough stone walls. The cave was larger than it had seemed from the outside, its ceiling lost in the gloom above. As Elias moved forward, he noticed strange markings etched into the walls. They were ancient, their meaning unclear, but they seemed to tell a story. Figures of men and women drinking from a river, their faces twisted in agony or ecstasy. Some appeared to be fleeing, while others knelt as if in worship. Elias ran his fingers over the carvings, a sense of unease settling in his chest. The legend of the Silver River was older than he had realized, and the cave seemed to be a testament to its power and its danger. The deeper he went, the more the cave seemed to come alive. Strange whispers filled the air, soft and indistinct, like the murmurs of a distant crowd. At first, Elias thought it was the sound of the wind or the echoes of the waterfall outside, but the voices grew clearer as he pressed on. They were speaking to him, though he couldn't make out the words. The tone was urgent, almost pleading, and it sent a chill down his spine. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice echoing through the cavern. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. He tightened his grip on the torch and continued forward, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The cave began to narrow, the walls closing in around him until he was forced to crouch to pass through. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time. They were no longer indistinct. Now he could hear fragments of sentences, words that seemed to tug at his memories. "Do you remember the first time you saw her?" one voice asked, soft and melodic. "The way she smiled at you, like you were the only person in the world," another added. Elias froze, his heart pounding. The voices were talking about Lila. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the whispers persisted, growing more insistent. "You're doing this for her, aren't you?" the first voice said. "But what if you forget her? What if you drink from the river and lose everything that makes you who you are?" Elias clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I won't forget her," he muttered. "I can't." The whispers laughed, a sound that was both mocking and sorrowful. "You don't know what you're capable of," they said in unison. "The river takes more than it gives." Elias pressed on, determined to silence the voices in his head. The cave began to widen again, opening into a large chamber. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water, its surface perfectly still. The torchlight reflected off the water, casting shimmering patterns on the walls. Elias approached the pool cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. As he drew closer, he realized that the water wasn't water at all. It was silver, flowing and shifting like liquid metal. The silver river. He had found it. Elias knelt by the edge of the pool, his reflection staring back at him. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a profound silence. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small vial, its glass glinting in the torchlight. He had brought it to collect the silver water, to bring it back to Lila. But as he dipped the vial into the pool, a voice spoke, clear and resonant. "Drink," it said. Elias looked around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from within him, deep and commanding. "Drink," it repeated. "Prove your devotion. Prove your love." Elias hesitated, the vial trembling in his hand. He had come so far, endured so much, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure he could go through with it. What if the whispers were right? What if he forgot Lila, forgot everything they had shared? But then he thought of her, lying in their bed, her breath shallow and her skin pale. He thought of the life they had built together, the love that had sustained them through so many trials. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't. With a deep breath, Elias raised the vial to his lips and drank. The silver water was cold and metallic, its taste unlike anything he had ever experienced. It burned as it slid down his throat, spreading through his body like fire. For a moment, he felt nothing but the heat, the intensity of it overwhelming. And then, slowly, the heat faded, replaced by a strange numbness. Elias stood, his legs unsteady, and looked around the chamber. The torchlight seemed dimmer now, the shadows deeper. He felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But as he tried to recall what that weight had been, he found that he couldn't. His memories were slipping away, like sand through his fingers. Panic surged through him as he realized what was happening. The curse. He was forgetting. He clutched at his head, trying to hold on to the memories, but they were fading too quickly. Lila's face, her voice, the way she had looked at him. It was all slipping away. "No," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. "No, please. I can't forget her. I can't." But the river's curse was relentless. By the time Elias stumbled out of the cave and into the cold mountain air, he could no longer remember why he had come. He could no longer remember her, the stranger in the mirror. Elias stumbled down the mountain path, his mind a foggy haze. The journey back to Eldermere was a blur, his body moving on autopilot as his thoughts churned in confusion. He couldn't remember why he had been in the mountains or what he had been searching for. All he knew was that he had to return to the village. Something or someone was waiting for him there. When he finally reached Eldermere, the sun was setting, casting the village in a warm, golden light. The familiar sights and sounds should have brought him comfort, but instead, they felt alien, as if he were seeing them for the first time. The thatched roofs, the cobblestone streets, the smell of bread baking in the ovens. It was all strangely unfamiliar. As he walked through the village, people greeted him with smiles and waves, but their faces meant nothing to him. He nodded in response, his expression blank, and continued on his way. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet seemed to carry him forward, as if guided by some unseen force. Eventually, he found himself standing in front of a small cottage at the edge of the village. The garden was overgrown, the flowers wilted and untended. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar. Elias hesitated, a strange ache in his chest as he stared at the cottage. Felt important, though he couldn't say why. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, the room dimly lit by the fading light from the windows. The furniture was simple but well-made, the walls adorned with tapestries and paintings. A fire had burned low in the hearth, its embers still glowing faintly. Elias moved through the cottage, his fingers brushing against the objects on the shelves. A wooden carving of a bird, a jar of dried herbs, a book with a worn leather cover. Each item stirred something in him, a flicker of memory that vanished before he could grasp it. In the bedroom, he found her. She was lying in bed, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow. Her dark hair was spread across the pillow, and her hands were clasped over her chest. She looked peaceful, as if she were sleeping, but Elias could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, the slight flutter of her eyelids. She was alive, but barely. He knelt beside the bed, his heart pounding. He didn't know who she was, but the sight of her filled him with a deep, aching sorrow. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against hers. Her skin was cold, and he felt a surge of panic, though he didn't understand why. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why do I feel like I know you?" She didn't respond, her face serene in sleep. Elias squeezed her hand, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't know what to do. He didn't even know who he was. As he sat there, clutching her hand, a memory surfaced. A fragment of a dream, or perhaps a fragment of reality. He saw her laughing, her eyes sparkling as she reached out to him. He heard her voice, soft and melodic, saying his name. "Elias," she had said. "My love." The memory was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving him more confused than ever. He stood abruptly, his head spinning, and stumbled to the mirror on the wall. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't the face he expected to see. He looked older, his face lined with worry, his eyes hollow and haunted. He didn't recognize the man in the mirror. "Who am I?" he asked aloud, his voice trembling. "What have I done?" There was no answer, only the silence of the cottage and the faint sound of her breathing. Elias turned away from the mirror, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to find them. He didn't even know where to begin. As he stood there, lost in thought, a knock came at the door. Elias hesitated, then went to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was Thaddeus, the old storyteller. His expression was grave, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Elias," Thaddeus said softly, "you've returned." Elias stared at him, his brow furrowed. "Do I know you?" Thaddeus's face fell, and he sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this. The river's curse has taken hold of you." "The river," Elias repeated, the words stirring something in him. "What river?" Thaddeus stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "The Silver River. You went there to save her." He gestured toward the bedroom, his voice filled with regret. "But the river demands a price. Those who drink from it lose their memories. They forget who they are." Elias's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. He had gone to the river to save her. This woman whose name he couldn't remember, whose face was both familiar and foreign. He had drunk from the river, and now he was paying the price. "What do I do?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I fix this?" Thaddeus shook his head. "There is no fixing it, Elias. The curse is permanent. But perhaps there is a way to recover what you've lost. The river's power is great, but it is not absolute. If you can find the strength to remember, to hold on to the love that drove you to the river in the first place, you may yet find a way back to yourself." Elias looked back at the bedroom, his heart aching. He didn't know if he could do it. He didn't even know if he wanted to. But as he stood there, staring at the woman who had once been his everything, he knew he had to try. The weight of eternity. Elias spent the next few days in a haze, torn between the fragments of his past and the emptiness of his present. Thaddeus stayed with him, helping him piece together the life he had lost. The old storyteller spoke of Lila, her kindness, her laughter, the love she and Elias had shared. He showed Elias the cottage, pointing out the small details that spoke of their life together. The quilt she had sewn, the garden she had tended, the letters they had written to each other during their brief separations. But no matter how hard Elias tried, the memories wouldn't come. He could see the evidence of their life together, but it felt like reading about strangers in a book. The love Thaddeus spoke of was a distant echo, a shadow of something he could no longer grasp. Lila remained unconscious, her condition unchanged. The healers came and went, their faces grim. They whispered among themselves, their words too soft for Elias to hear, but he could guess what they were saying. She was fading, and there was nothing they could do. One night, as Elias sat by Lila's bedside, He found himself staring at the vial of silver water he had brought back from the river. It glinted in the dim light, a reminder of the choice he had made and the price he had paid. He turned it over in his hands, his thoughts swirling. "If I drink it again," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him, "will it bring her back, or will it take even more from me?" The room was silent, save for the sound of Lila's shallow breathing. Elias closed his eyes, trying to summon the strength to make a decision. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. He didn't even know who he was anymore. The next morning, Thaddeus found Elias in the garden, staring at the wilted flowers. The old man sat beside him, his expression thoughtful. "You're struggling," Thaddeus said. "I can see it in your eyes." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I can trust my own thoughts." "The river's curse is a heavy burden," Thaddeus replied, "but it's not insurmountable. Love is a powerful force, Elias. It can endure even the darkest of trials." "But what if I can't remember that love?" Elias asked, his voice breaking. "What if it's gone forever?" Thaddeus placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not gone. It's still there, buried beneath the curse. You just have to find it." Elias looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "How?" Thaddeus hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to Lila. She used to write in it every day. Perhaps it will help you remember." Elias took the journal, his hands trembling. He opened it to the first page and began to read. The entries were written in Lila's elegant handwriting, each one a glimpse into her thoughts and feelings. She wrote about their life together, their joys, their struggles, their dreams for the future. She wrote about him, about the love they shared, about the moments that had defined their relationship. As Elias read, something stirred within him. It was faint at first, like a distant memory, but it grew stronger with each page. He could almost hear her voice, see her smile, feel the warmth of her hand in his. The memories were still fragmented, but they were there, just beneath the surface. By the time he reached the last entry, tears were streaming down his face. The final words were written in a shaky hand, as if she had been struggling to hold the pen. "My dearest Elias, if you're reading this, then I am no longer with you. But know this, my love for you is eternal. It is the one thing the river cannot take away. Remember me, my love. Remember us." Elias closed the journal, his heart aching. He could feel the weight of the curse lifting, if only slightly. The memories were still hazy, but they were there, waiting to be reclaimed. He stood and went back inside, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. Lila was still lying in bed, her face peaceful. Elias knelt beside her and took her hand, his tears falling onto the blanket. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember you, Lila. I remember us." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were cloudy, unfocused, but they found his, and she smiled. "Elias," she said, her voice weak but filled with love. "You came back." Elias choked back a sob and pressed her hand to his lips. "I'm here, Lila. I'm here." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers trembling. "I knew you would." Elias stayed by her side as the hours passed, holding her hand and whispering words of love. He told her about the river, about the curse, about the struggle to remember. She listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his. When the end came, it was peaceful. Lila's breathing slowed, and her hand grew cold in his. But her smile never faded, and her eyes never lost their warmth. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Always." And then she was gone. Elias sat there for a long time, holding her hand and staring at her face. The pain was unbearable, but so was the love. It filled him, overwhelming the curse, pushing back the darkness. He could remember now, not everything, but enough. Enough to know who he was. Enough to know what he had lost. When he finally stood, he felt a strange sense of peace. The curse was still there, a shadow in the back of his mind, but it no longer controlled him. He had reclaimed his memories, his identity, his love. And though Lila was gone, her love would remain with him, a beacon in the darkness. Elias left the cottage that night, the journal tucked under his arm. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he would carry Lila with him, always. The river's curse had taken much from him, but it could never take that.